Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
My name is Lindsay Calloway, and I'm one of your hosts for the Faith Trends Podcast. This is the second of a two-part series with Dr. Andy Steiger about AI, or artificial intelligence. In the last episode, Andy helped us understand what AI is. In this episode, we're going to talk about AI and this cultural moment. What does artificial intelligence mean for our society, for our churches, and how do we think about it ourselves? You won't want to miss this conversation with Andy.
Andy Steiger, welcome back to the Faith Trends Podcast. We are talking in this episode about AI and this cultural moment, but I feel as a bit of a recap, we need to go back further to understand where we're at. And so every historical moment has an older context. But you trace our moment back to Alan Turing and something that we call the Turing test or the imitation game. Can you talk to us about what this is and why a conversation that started during the Second World War, perhaps even earlier, matters for the conversation that we're having now?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be back. The conversation that we kind of ended on was with regards to Michael Polanyi and Alan Turing, and those two debating whether or not thinking could be mechanical. Ultimately, those two would have a debate/dialogue where they would debate this. Polanyi argued no, that you could not have that. Turing argued yes, that you could. And Polanyi basically argued that no, this wasn't possible because you can't really define thinking. And he argued that tacit knowledge couldn't be made explicit. So we talked about this last time, that we're talking about this silent doing knowledge, that there's no way to teach my 16-year-old how to drive other than putting him behind the wheel. So Polanyi didn't foresee that there could be machine learning. Turing agreed that thinking can't be easily defined, but that he argued that a machine could learn and could imitate it or could demonstrate thinking. Now, you might be wondering, why do we need the history lesson? Because that debate ultimately kind of set up the cultural moment we're in. These two kind of opposing ideas. Can thinking be mechanical? Can it not? And if it can be mechanical, how would we even know? How are we even going to define that? Because we can't even define thinking to begin with. Well, the very next year after this debate, Turing published a very famous article in the Journal of Mind called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. In that article, he kind of set the groundwork, if you will, for the debates that would happen to this moment that we're in, and that would guide the sci-fi movies that we would watch. All the debates and many of the sci-fi movies we watch are riffs off of this article that Turing proposed. And in it, as you're asking, Rick, he talks about something called the Turing test, or what he calls the imitation game. And the imitation game is just simply his answer to Polanyi. So he ultimately agreed you can't define thinking, but he said, well, what we could do is we could demonstrate it. And if you demonstrate it, that's equivalent to thinking. And so he proposed this test or game. And just to simplify it, I won't get into the details, but just to simplify it, the idea of the game was that if you were in a conversation with a machine, but you didn't know you were in a conversation with a machine, that the machine could deceive you into thinking you were having a conversation with a person. So this could be a text. In his mind, Turing's mind, this would have been more like a handwritten. For us, this would have been like a text conversation that is convincing you that it's a machine. And if it could do that, then it would be said that the machine won. What does the machine win? It would be viewed as being thinking, that the machine is thinking, and the degree to which it could imitate a person or deceive you of its humanity, Turing would say would be the equivalent of being human or having a mind, that he would see those as synonymous. But you got to remember, it's because of the worldview that he's coming at the question from.
So if we could just dive into the worldviews a little bit deeper, I think Alan Turing would say that comes from an objectivist perspective. And then I think the term is personal knowledge. That's what Polanyi advocated for. So could you describe those a little bit and how that matters to this conversation? Why did these worldviews affect what they thought?
Yeah, the objectivist worldview was a kind of a catch-all term that Polanyi used to refer to any worldview that had this physicalist perspective that saw the world as just physical stuff. And this physical stuff can explain everything. This is kind of like the foundations of scientism. I'm trying to make this really simplified for the listeners. So that's why you have some people that think, oh, science can answer everything. And that's also why you have some computer scientists that think that computer science can answer everything as well, right? Because if it's just physical stuff, then it's a matter of just organizing it in specific kinds of ways, that there's nothing more going on here than that. Whereas Polanyi was saying, no, that's not quite right, that there's something to being human, that we not only have knowledge, but we have personal knowledge. I am aware of the world. I have a first-person awareness of the world. Now, maybe here's just a way to kind of tease us out with an example that's maybe a little bit more clear. So Turing's arguing if you have a machine that can imitate a person, then that's the equivalent. Whereas Polanyi would say, okay, then on that note, if we were to take that, that means if you have a machine that is pretending to be in pain, is it in pain? And we would say, well, no, there's a difference between the act of a thing or the behavior of a thing and the reality of it, the first person experience of it. And so Polanyi from personal knowledge is saying, no, there's such a thing as actually being in pain and having an awareness of the world and of yourself that he refers to as personal knowledge. Now, this becomes then a very important distinction that has been debated and continues to be debated. And that is, and this might shock some people, but if you follow the philosophies of people like Turing and others that would have held into this catch-all objectionist view, they really don't think that people have a mind to begin with at all. They don't think that you have personal knowledge. They don't think that you actually are even conscious. You have the illusion of consciousness. Today, by the way, I don't know when this will be aired, but Daniel Dennett passed away today. And he was a philosopher that has been promoting this for a very long time. He's a long lineage of philosophers that have been promoting this, that you and I don't really exist, that we're just meat computers that think that we have this, consciousness thing. I know that's crazy, but that's the reality.
Now, does Polanyi's argument, did it require a theism in his worldview, or did he think that personal knowledge existed even without a conception of a God?
I would say that no, he saw that theism was necessary to his worldview, and I think that's why he was drawn to Christian theology in particular, because he realized that you would have to have something operating outside of the system. Let me give you an example of how this one would work. And this is kind of helpful just to appreciate how we understand what a thing is. Polanyi would argue that we define a thing not by its parts. That would be an objectivist perspective. Polanyi says we don't define a thing by its parts. We define a thing by its purpose. And that these are two different but helpful ways of seeing the world. There's a difference between the parts a thing is made of and the purposeful whole a thing is made for. And that we naturally define a created thing by its purpose. And so if you go along those lines, because humans are able to create things and we are able to give things purpose, but the purpose isn't found in the machine, for example, it's found in the person. So on that note, Polanyi would define then a machine that passes the Turing test or the imitation game. He would define that as an artificial human, or he would define that as a machine designed for the purpose of deceiving people into thinking it's human. Right? It's being defined by its purpose. It can't just jump what it is because it's pretending to be something. Does that make sense with regards to just kind of the nature of what a thing is and what's giving that thing its nature? Because Polanyi would be asking, well, what gave us our nature? And then you start to have theological conversations immediately from that.
I think that was a really great way of putting it. And it's not beyond me either that the Oscar-winning song of this year is called What Was I Made For? That's coming from the Barbie movie. I know I've talked to Rick about this too. And then I just watched a new Disney movie with my kids called Wish. And the whole premise of that is that we're all made out of stardust. So we're still seeing these themes play out in popular culture.
Well, I think that's such a great example. I saw a book that back when my kids were, I'd read, kids' books to them when they were children. I got this book from the library called You Are Stardust.
That's it.
That is being driven from a philosophical worldview.
Right.
You're made of carbon, carbon's made from dying stars, and thus you are stardust. See, that's a perspective to say you are what you're made of. That's that physicalist perspective. Whereas we would say, no, there's a difference between the parts you're made of and the purpose you're made for. And so you're seeing this in culture, by the way. Culture is really pushing back right now against this reductionist perspective of defining things by its parts. And I think that that's a great door actually for us in ministry to have these bigger conversations that are necessary to navigate this technological moment that we're in.
Other places that you're going to see this play out in culture, and this is a little bit of an older example, but in Star Trek, you have the transporter where you're sort of, all of your atoms are taken apart and then reassembled somewhere else, right? And the idea is that will just work.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're just those parts. That's all.
You're just those parts. We'll just put you back together in an array. Andy, I've been over time flummoxed by digital signatures. I know younger people they're very comfortable with that. But I kind of grew up in an era where we watched crime dramas and, there was always forgers and you were always looking at signatures to see if they were real. And I'm putting that in scare quotes. So we accept things in our lives as digital substitutes for the real thing. And it's even thought of as better because it doesn't have any of the inconveniences of the physical world. In your thesis, you talk about ontology or ontologies, and that just has to do with our ideas of being, but you talk about how virtual space is dependent on the physical space for computer chips and for electricity, if anything else. And it's this idea of you have this AI world that is dependent on the real world. How's that relationship going to work going forward as AI becomes more and more important?
Yeah, this, I think, is a question that we'll need once again to think more about. And it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about with how do we define what a thing is, that when we understand that our technology is a tool that humans are creating. By the way, this kind of reframes the way you see things once you start to really understand what I'm getting at here. For example, I told you earlier that Deep Blue by IBM beat the world's best chess player, Garry Kasparov. I actually don't see it that way. Now what I see, when you start to really think about this more, you realize a team of engineers at IBM created a tool that beat the world's best chess player. And what you start to see then is that there is this inherent connection between us and the things we make and the purposes that we make things for. And so it's kind of an odd thing then if we're making human imitation machines. We have to ask ourselves, why are we doing that? What kind of a tool is that? Or is it actually more a reflection of ourselves than it is of anything? And so this can kind of be seen in a couple ways then. One is the sense that machines are dependent on us. You can have a world full of humans and no machines, but you can't have a world full of machines and no humans. There is an inherent connection between us and the machines. The machines are dependent on us, that we've created them. And in that connection, there is this idea then that they've been created for a purpose, and that purpose is either going to be to help people, or that's often being the case these days, that we're driving it more and more to be its own thing, that some people might want to give it some sort of status. And I don't know if you've seen that machine called Sophia that was granted citizenship in Saudi Arabia in 2017 and given person status. I think we have to ask ourselves, well, what kind of a worldview is driving that sort of desire to do that with technology? Because you were asking, Rick, about what the real is. Well, it's ultimately going to be the worldview that's guiding us on how we use these technologies that's going to answer that question. What are the purposes that we're creating these for? Are we creating human imitation machines, or are we creating tools to help humans? That raises bigger questions than what does it mean to help a person?
I think sometimes we don't realize just the scale of the resources that are needed for these AI models to run. I heard Sam Altman from OpenAI said to be looking for investments of $7 trillion to get to what he calls artificial general intelligence. That's his goal. And when you realize that Sam Altman's looking for 7 million, but probably, or trillion with a T, and Google's probably looking for that, and Microsoft's probably looking for that. There's this enormous diversion of our resources into AI. And even you've got companies like, I think Amazon is talking about building their own nuclear power plants to power their data centers because they're just so hungry for power.
That is not an interesting. First of all, I marvel at that, to think how much effort it's taken for us to create something that doesn't even compare currently to the human brain. Yes, it can do certain things better than us, but there is so much that a human is capable of that a machine's not. And I mean, to me, on one hand, I'm like, man, that is quite marvelous. However, and this might surprise listeners, because I get asked this question all the time when I'm teaching or speaking. They'll ask me, Andy, do you think that a machine could be conscious one day? That could we achieve that? With $7 billion, is it possible that we could create that kind of a machine? And I personally actually don't even have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with something that we might call a machine conscience. And one of the reasons I say that is because I was telling one of my students recently, I said, listen, I got a dog named Wilson, and I don't have a problem that he's got a conscience, or he's conscious at some level. I want to be careful. I wasn't saying that he's got like a moral compass. I'm saying that he's got some level of awareness. When he gets up in the morning, I don't know what he's going to do in the day. I'm just hoping he's not going to pee in the house, right? But I can't guarantee that. He's going to do what he's going to do. But I would say, he's got a dog consciousness. Whereas, if we take a machine, for example, I wouldn't have a problem with us spending $7 trillion, and maybe we could achieve those sorts of things. Here's the reason I'm bringing this up, that I think we've got to be careful when we're having these conversations. Christians have often fallen into a theological trap I call human exceptionalism, where we think of our humanity according to what we're exceptional at. The challenge here, of course, is as AI gets better and better at things, we're not so exceptional anymore. We once were really good at bench pressing, and then we made a forklift, and now all of a sudden we suck in comparison. And we once were really good at playing chess, but now we suck in comparison. Do you know what I'm saying? We have to be careful, or this is what can happen. As you begin by doing that, you actually set up the parameters for what it means to be human. And that means then that if you start to base your humanity on something you're exceptional at, well, if a machine can achieve that, then it's granted humanness. And you have to also be careful, because if a human doesn't, they lose their humanity. This is where I think things like the UN's Declaration of Human Rights can be helpful when we talk about the inherentness of our value, that we were born with it, it wasn't given. And that if we start to, not to belabor this, but if you start to see this, if you take a worldview perspective from the Christian perspective, we're saying, yes, we are exceptional, but we're not exceptional in our ability to bench press or play chess games. We're exceptional in that God loves us, created us in his image, and made us for the purpose of relationship with God and each other. That starts to reframe this so that I don't have to get caught up in this man versus machine dialogue that's going on in our culture right now. Sorry, that was a long answer, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it's very helpful.
I think that's really helpful. Yeah. Now, in your thesis, you say that Polanyi, and I'm quoting this, he identified the moral erosion and objectivism that undermined religion. So to key in on this, we're watching the culture and this steady slide away from religion generally and Christianity in particular, and we're always trying to understand why. So how does objectivism erode morals?
Just simply put, this is what one of the things that Nietzsche was prophetic about and pointed people to, a worldview that he embraced, that if you embrace a purely physical view of the world, he ultimately said that God is dead within that worldview because God's not even a possibility. So it's not that we killed God. God's just not a possibility within that worldview. It's what's referred to philosophically as a closed-off universe. There can't be anything beyond the physical, such as God, but more than that, and this was Polanyi's point, it's not only God who's dead, you're dead. Because in that kind of a worldview, you can't have people either. You can't also have purpose. You can't have meaning. But to your point, Lindsay, you can't have morality, right? Because you can't find morality under a microscope, and you can't find it in a telescope. It's not a physical thing. That we're talking about this moral quality. And by morals, we just mean that there is a way that relationships ought to be, that we should live in a certain type of relationship and not in another kind of relationship. By the way, I pastored for 20 years, and I can tell you right now, of all the weddings I've ever officiated, no one's ever asked me, Andy, what should I vow to my spouse? I'm not sure. Should I vow faithfulness or unfaithfulness, right? We understand that there's a moral quality to the way a relationship should be, and by and large, we understand what that relationship ought to look like. This is having an interesting effect, by the way, technologically, because we're really having to rethink the worldview that we've embraced for so long, because now as we create these machines, such as a self-driving car, we're realizing that this is more than just a task of can we achieve this, but we also have to ask, what ought this machine do? And who's going to be morally responsible when it gets it wrong? And so it's interesting to me because when I'm a part of those conversations with the AI engineers, that's the big question that's being asked. It's the moral question. I do find it fascinating, by the way, back to that just quickly. Notice that they're not questioning, oh, we don't need to worry about that because morality doesn't exist.
Right.
They assume that morality does exist. We do need to answer it. But the problem is they don't have a worldview that can wrestle with it appropriately.
And there's not really, a techie Hippocratic oath equivalent, is there? Maybe we ought to adopt one.
And that becomes problematic in and of itself. Where are we going to find the value of human life?
Right.
So, Andy, you were just saying that, Nietzsche came to the conclusion that God was dead, and that meant that we were dead. And this sort of raises the question of anthropology and who we are as humans if AI can play the imitation game so well that we can't tell the difference. And, sometimes I look for analogies in order to try and understand our cultural moment. And where I keep going back to is the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, you had all these people migrating to cities to work in dangerous factories for poor wages and living in tenements that were substandard. And it could be argued that people were reduced to those parts of the factory machines that they hadn't been able to fashion into gears and levers yet. And so now we have musicians, computer programmers, actors, and all manner of workers who are staring down their own kind of new industrial revolution as AI, it appears, is going to render them obsolete. And the assurances from, all the AI executives that these displaced people, well, they'll just do something else because that's what we've always done. That kind of rings a little hollow to me. And so pastors have people in their congregations that are going to lose their jobs. They're going to face real job loss. So what do pastors say to a culture rushing to embrace this objectivist future? Should we oppose this? Should we embrace this? How do you talk to somebody who just lost their job because AI took it?
I know it's interesting, right? All of a sudden we're like, man, maybe the Amish had it right. Because I think some people, Rick, to your point, are like, should we abandon technology? Is technology evil? I would actually argue that technology is neither good nor evil. I think of it as neutral. It's really, what are you doing with the technology? To your point, I think this is something that we are going to need to talk about more and more. And that is, how is technology helping us and how is it harming us? And this is a question we haven't asked a lot about. Mainly, we've just been asking, is it possible? Right? And let's see what's possible. What can we do? Not what is good for us to do. Because the reality is there have been times that we've created technologies that are really good because they're actually valuing human life. For example, there are certain jobs that people shouldn't do. They're dangerous or they're repetitively harmful to humans. And it's actually great to automate those things. That actually respects human value. And maybe those jobs we need to lose. You need to go find a different job. That's not a job that values human life. However, we're also having this kind of flip take place where now we're asking, well, what happens if we're outsourcing everything? Or maybe we have jobs that actually are important for humans to have. Here's an analogy that might be helpful that I like to use to think about this. If you want to talk about this question, because really what we're asking now is about human flourishing. If you want to ask a question about how a human flourishes, you first have to answer the question, what was the person created for? Flourishing is defined by its purpose. And I'll give you an analogy. For example, I like Ferraris, so I'll use a Ferrari as an analogy. If a Ferrari's going down the road, right, and it gets a flat tire, it's on the side of the road, has it lost its status of a Ferrari? Like, is it no longer a Ferrari because it has a flat tire? We would say, of course not. It's still a Ferrari. In other words, you don't have to fully achieve the purpose that you were created for to still be that thing. To speak in philosophical terms, it hasn't lost its ontology. Its ontology is still there. Its ability to fulfill the purpose it was created for has been hindered. And then we would ask then, well, is a Ferrari with a flat tire, is it flourishing? And I would say, well, no, it's not flourishing. Why isn't it flourishing? Well, because it's not achieving the purpose it was created for. Cars were created to go from point A to point B. Ferraris were created to go from point A to point B just really quickly. Right? So a Ferrari going down a track then at 200 kilometers an hour is a Ferrari that's flourishing. It's fulfilling its purpose. We can look at this then from a perspective of humans then. Well, from a Christian perspective, back to worldview, from a Christian perspective, we're like a Ferrari with a flat tire. We call it sin, right? Evil. That we were created for the purpose of right relationship with God, right relationship with one another, but that relationship has been broken. And so it's not like we've lost our humanity because of sin and evil, but we're like a flat tire. And this is where Jesus is so significant, right? Jesus, when he comes, that Jesus makes a way that our relationship with God and one another could be reconciled, like fixes the flat, if you will. First of all, we see what a Ferrari looks like in Jesus, what it actually looks like to be a human. And then we can learn from him to be like that. This is going to be important, I would say, Rick, for us to navigate this technological revolution. And it's important, you said that at the beginning of your question, and I think that's important to reiterate. It's not that we're on the cusp of a revolution, we are in the midst of a revolution. We are in an artificial intelligence revolution, and it is and will continue to revolutionize the way things are going. The question we've got to be asking, particularly pastors need to be asking, as they are counseling, somebody through this and a congregation through this, not just with jobs, but how they're using technology in general, is how do you understand what it means to be human? How do you understand what it means to flourish as a human being? How do we as the church seek to communicate that and help society understand that? And do we really believe, as Jesus taught, that relationship is central to what it means to be human? Relationship with God, relationship with people. And do we embody that as a church? Do we believe that as a church? And then are we engaged in the conversation that's happening in society at a worldview level that's guiding this? Because there once was a time when you had Google and Apple. This is a true story between Google and Apple. They both have viewed technology from a different worldview. One from intelligence augmentation perspective, Google approached it from, with regards to this idea that machines are designed to help people. The purpose of a machine is to help a person. Whereas Apple approached it more from the idea of, we'll make a machine to be a person. That debate ultimately was lost, and Google then started going the way of Apple and started making more and more technologies to be human in that sense. I think we got to get back into that conversation where we're at a societal level asking, what are we creating these machines for, and what's ultimately going to lead to our good? If we don't get back to that question, I think we're going to be lost.
There's a verse in Psalm 115:8 that's talking about idols, but it says, those who make them become like them, so do all who trust them. And, we do become like the things that we make. In the past, we would have heard people, especially in the society of men, if you're in a gym and you're doing reps and you're just going and going, someone will say, you're like a machine. And they mean to pay you a compliment, right, for your strength and stamina, but they're saying that you're like a machine. And so we become like the tools, but that was from the age of machines. But now we're headed for a world where we say, are we going to say, well, you're like a large language model? Or, of course, this is trickier because the verses that come right before Psalm 115, verse 8, it talks about idols that can't see, hear, or speak. And now we have AI that can do all of these things, at least well enough to pass a Turing test. Is there a danger that we lose our humanity as we become like the machines that we make?
Yeah, I think that's really well put. In fact, notice that it cuts both ways, that it can be dehumanizing from both perspectives. From one perspective, where a person's being viewed as a machine, and from the other perspective, where a person begins to view themselves as a machine. You can have this, cutting both ways. Particularly even from a society's perspective, or even from the business perspective of how am I treating my employees? How do I see those employees and the work that they're doing, and how are these employees, viewing themselves? And especially in wider societies, we start to kind of see ourselves more and more, as Dawkins would say, as just DNA, right? That we just dance to our DNA. Are we just a biological code? Or is there something more to who we are and more to what ultimately guides us? Let me put it in this perspective that kind of plays off of what you're saying, Rick. Jesus came saying, follow me. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised to new life. But Google comes along and says, we can do that too. The lame walk, the deaf hear. We'll even upload your mind to the cloud. You can even have eternal life. Instead of, in God we trust, these days it's in tech we trust. And in some regards, if you take this far enough, not only is it dehumanizing, but it's de-deifying, right? It's becoming its own religion in of itself. It's becoming that technology becomes this religion where people can put their hope in that. And this goes back to what I've been trying to get at throughout our conversation, that this really is losing sight of the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview would reframe that and say, well, no, when Jesus, first of all, when he was saying that, he was saying that you can trust that I can do something even greater than healing the lame and the deaf, and something even greater than defeating death. Because a lot of Christians have a misunderstanding of Christianity. They think it's about living forever. It's not about living forever. Jesus says in John 17, he says, this is eternal life, that they may know you. It's about relationship with God forever. It's about community with one another. It's going back to that idea of relationship. And I keep bringing this up because I think it's an important worldview to help navigate the technology. Is this leading to bettering my relationship with God and people, or detracting from it? I mean, you could only imagine how it's detracting if you think it's supplementing your view of heaven. If heaven is just living forever, then there's people that just want to upload their minds to the cloud. But from a Christian perspective, we wouldn't see that as heaven. We would see that as hell. And so I think we really got to kind of reframe how we're viewing, again, ourselves and our relationship with God to how it's impacting our relationship with technology. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, very helpful.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we should end there, but I want to ask one more question. I'm just thinking, evangelicalism really it was launched out of these revivalist movements that corresponded during the time of the Industrial Revolution. And so, Christians very intentionally decided to intervene at this time in a time of hopelessness and misery in response to what they saw around them. So really practically, how do we respond as a church? And I know you've mentioned, this emphasis on relationship. Do you have ideas about how we can come together and respond as evangelicals in Canada, or what we can do in our cities, in our homes? There's all these different areas where we can have impact. But I want to know, do you have any ideas of really practically on the ground what we can be doing?
Here's my thoughts on that question. It's a great question, Lindsay. I would say that if you look statistically at what's going on right now, we went through a pandemic with COVID or whatever, but I would argue that we have been in a pandemic of loneliness way before COVID, and we're still in the midst of it. If you look at the research that's out, there was research that was just done in 142 countries. 142 countries. It just came out last year, and it determined that 1 in 4 people are lonely. I was doing a talk recently in Texas with John Lennox, and he and I were asked, what's your concerns with AI and the direction of AI? And my argument was loneliness, this idea of outsourcing your humanity. So to answer your question, Lindsay, I would say on a very practical note, I would be asking, how much do we really value community at our church? How much do we really value relationships? And that happens at 2 levels. One level, it happens on the personal level. Am I willing to put my phone down and engage with my children on a very practical level and engage with my spouse? And is technology, driving me, or am I the one driving technology and using it to my benefit? Or am I just a slave to my technology? Am I just addicted to my programs? That would be on a very practical level from the personal. And that might mean that you got to make some life choices. Like just on a personal perspective, for me, for example, I've removed social media from my phone. If I use it for work, it's only on my computer. I've done that to distance myself from my phone at some level. And I don't know if you guys heard of dummy phones.
Mm-hmm.
That's becoming a popular thing, that you can now buy a phone that's just dumb, right? Because you want to give yourself more separation from the tech. And you have to ask, well, why? Well, I would say so you could spend more time with people. Now, from a church's perspective, I think on a very practical level, we have to really invest more into community groups and understand that one of the greatest evangelistic moves that we can make right now is community, is dealing with the loneliness issue. It's what we were always meant to be doing. I just think that we're seeing it maybe better now than ever before. People need community. They need community with people, of course, but they need a community that runs much deeper, community with God. And so I think the church needs to really think about how are they answering the loneliness epidemic. 1 in 4.
Andy Steiger, thank you so much for being our guest on the Faith Trends podcast. For our listeners, this is the second of a 2-part series on AI that we've done with Andy. You'll be sure to want to find the first episode if you haven't heard it and listen to that. Andy has recently written a book, Reclaimed, How Jesus Restores Our Humanity in a Dehumanized World, and we'll have links to that in the show notes. Andy, if people want to learn more about your work or to contact you, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can learn more about me at apologeticscanada.com, and they can always feel free to reach out to me at andy@apologeticscanada.com.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.